The most dangerous places on Earth look completely normal, and the most unsettling disappearances in American history didn't happen on battlefields or in storms. They happened in towns, ordinary towns, towns with hardware stores and schoolhouses and church bells that rang every Sunday. And then, one day, they didn't. Today, we're walking through 13 American towns that ceased to exist. Not towns that declined, not towns that were forgotten, towns that were erased by floods, by poison, by government orders, by fire, by forces that still have no clean explanation. Some of them vanished in a single week, one of them vanished in a single night, and one of them, the one we're saving for last, left behind a clue so strange that researchers are still arguing about what it means. We'll stand in a valley where an entire population abandoned their homes in 48 hours, and nobody was officially told why. We'll look at a post office with mail still sorted in the slots, dated decades ago, waiting for carriers who never came back. And finally, a settlement where the last record anyone can find is a single phrase carved into wood, and the 215 people who lived there were never seen again. Deep breath. Let's go. 13. Welcome to the town that drowned itself. Glen Rio sits exactly on the state line between Texas and New Mexico, or rather, it sat there. Straddling the line like a man with one foot in two different worlds, this small Route 66 community thrived through the 1940s and into the 1950s as drivers and truckers paused for fuel, coffee, and a bed. The state line itself was a selling point. Texas bars closed early. New Mexico bars didn't. Clever business owners positioned themselves on whichever side of that invisible line suited the hour. But Glen Rio's strangest feature isn't the state line. It's the fact that when Interstate 40 bypassed the town in 1975, Glen Rio didn't just slow down. It stopped, almost instantaneously. Walk down what remains of the main road today, and the last motel in Texas still stands. Its painted sign facing the highway that no longer brings anyone past. The neon tube on the sign is long dead. A wooden porch out front has collapsed inward at a 45-degree angle, like a man bowing to an audience that left. Inside the old gas station, and you can peer through the broken glass, the pump counter still reads the last total filled. Weeds have pushed through the concrete floor in lines, as if the earth is slowly reclaiming the tiling, square by square. What makes Glen Rio remarkable isn't violence or disaster, it's the speed of the collapse. When the interstate moved, the town moved with it, in the minds of the drivers who had sustained it. Within a year, over 90% of residents had gone. The hardware closed, the diner closed. The school, which had educated children of ranching families for decades, locked its doors. Local historians note that Glen Rio's population in 1980 was listed officially as 0. A faded yellow road sign near the ruins still reads, __, quote, _0, __. Nobody knows who those two people were, or if the sign was ever accurate, or if it was a joke that outlived its punchline. The town didn't drown in water, it drowned in silence. But silence is almost a comfort compared to what forced the next town off the map. 12. Call it the poisoned parish. Pitcher, Oklahoma, was once the center of the richest lead and zinc mining district in the entire United States. At peak production, the mines beneath this small corner of Ottawa County supplied more than 50% of the metal used in ammunition during World War II. The ground beneath Pitcher produced so much ore that the waste rock, called chat, piled up into mountains. Gray, jagged hills of processed mine tailings rose 20 stories around the town, visible for miles across the flat Oklahoma plain. The chat piles look like something from another planet. Stand at the edge of one, and the ground underfoot is silver gray and powdery, the consistency of cold ash. No grass grows, no birds land on them. They are sterile monuments to extraction. The problem was what the mining left behind in the water and the soil. Blood lead levels in Pitcher's children registered among the highest ever recorded in any American community. Not in an industrial zone, not near a factory, but in a neighborhood of homes and yards and schools. The same streets where children played baseball and rode bicycles were sitting on top of ground so saturated with heavy metals that the soil itself was classified as a health hazard. By 2009, the federal government had been engaged in cleanup efforts for years, but the deeper problem emerged. The mines beneath the town had hollowed out the ground so completely that engineers calculated a serious risk of subsidence. The earth under Pitcher could, in measurable terms, simply give way. The government began buyouts. Most families took the money. Some didn't want to leave. What remains today are a few holdouts and the shells of buildings. The Pitcher Mining Museum, which once celebrated the industry that built the town, stands with its windows missing. Inside, old photographs of miners in hard hats line the walls. Their faces look proud. They didn't know yet what the ground was doing to them, or to their children, or to the children of their children. The last resident, a man named Gary Linderman, who ran a small shop, reportedly stayed until forced out. The last structures in Pitcher were demolished in 2013. Those Chat Mountains are still there. You can see them from the highway, gray and lunar and patient. The ground isn't gone, just everything that lived on it. 11. This one is called The Town Nobody Burned, because nobody needed to. Cahaba, Alabama was the first state capital of Alabama, not a small distinction. In 1820, when Alabama was new and ambitious and imagining its own great future, Cahaba was chosen as the seat of government. The state capitol building rose at the confluence of the Cahaba River and the Alabama River. The streets were surveyed and platted on a grid. Plots were sold. Homes were built. A state capitol was a statement of permanence. The problem was the rivers. Cahaba sat at a point where flooding was not an occasional inconvenience, but a recurring catastrophe. In 1825, major flooding drove the Alabama state government to relocate to Tuscaloosa. The government left, but the town didn't. Cahaba persisted for decades, becoming a regional commercial center, then declining, then reviving slightly, then declining again. By the time of the Civil War, the town had approximately 3,000 residents. After the war, with the economy shattered and the rail lines bypassing the area in favor of Selma, Cahaba's population dispersed over the following decades, down to nearly nothing. What's left today sits inside a state archaeological park. The old cemetery is the most intact feature. Headstones in uneven rows under the Spanish moss. Names and dates from the 1820s through the 1870s. The legible history of a town that lasted about 60 years. Near the confluence of the two rivers, concrete markers indicate where major buildings once stood. The foundation stones of the old capitol are visible when the water level is low enough. Brick walls emerge from the undergrowth along former streets. The roses are the strangest detail. Old rose bushes, planted by residents in the 19th century, still bloom every spring along the lines of streets that no longer exist. If you walk through Cahaba in May, you can trace the old road grid entirely by following the roses. Pink clusters where a fence once stood. Red blooms marking a yard no one has owned in 150 years. A capital city reduced to flowers following a ghost map. Next, a town that vanished not from neglect, but from a single decision made in a government office 600 miles away. 10. This is the Reservoir Town, the name it never wanted. Loyal Sock Township in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, had a post office, a general store, 2 churches, and a covered bridge that locals photographed every autumn when the maples turned orange. It was the kind of small American community that people use as a synonym for permanence. Families had farmed the same land for 4 and 5 generations. The cemetery held great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. In the early 1970s, the United States Army Corps of Engineers announced plans to build Loyalsock Dam. The reservoir would flood the valley. The valley contained the township. The township would need to be cleared. Government acquisition of private land for public projects is legal, and the displaced residents were compensated. But the word quote, _1___ carries a lot of weight. It often can't hold. Families received checks. They did not receive the covered bridge, or the sound of Loyalsock Creek through an open window on a summer morning, or the cemetery with their names going back 6 generations. The dam project was ultimately canceled in 1982, following environmental and community opposition. The valley was never flooded, but by the time the cancellation came, the township had been substantially cleared. Homes had been demolished or relocated. The community that had been told to leave had left. The covered bridge survived. It was relocated to a park in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where it now stands as a historical artifact, technically preserved, fundamentally displaced. A bridge that no longer crosses anything. The creek it once spanned still runs through what is now largely wild land. Past foundation stones half buried in the roots of trees that have grown up through former living rooms. Somewhere in those woods is the stone foundation of a farmhouse where someone's family lived for 140 years. The stones are still in their original positions. The house is gone, but the creek still sounds the same. 9. They called it the town that fire forgot, until fire found it anyway. Centralia, Pennsylvania is the most famous entry on this list, and it earned that fame through a phenomenon that is both mundane in its origin and almost incomprehensible in its persistence. In 1962, burning trash in a landfill near an abandoned mine shaft ignited the coal seams that run beneath the town. The fire spread underground. It has not stopped burning since. The Centralia mine fire is now 63 years old. It burns in coal seams as deep as 300 feet underground, at temperatures reaching over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the hottest sections. By some projections, it has enough coal to continue burning for another 250 years. Walk into Centralia today. Route 61, the main road that once passed through the center of town, has been closed and partially demolished, but sections remain. Cracks run across the old asphalt, and from some of those cracks, steam rises. On cold mornings, white vapor curls up from fissures in what used to be front yards. The ground radiates warmth even in January. Snow melts in uneven patches, the pattern determined not by sun, but by what's burning below. The official population of Centralia, Pennsylvania, was 1,100 in 1981. By 2020, it was 5. The government condemned and bought out most properties through the 1980s and 1990s. Most structures were demolished. The street grid still exists on maps. Some street signs still stand. But the houses are gone, replaced by open fields of grass growing over the hot ground. There is a spot on the old Route 61 where the asphalt has heaved and cracked into a long diagonal fracture. Graffiti covers the old road's surface, messages left by visitors over decades, layered on top of each other. Under your feet, barely 300 feet down, something is burning right now. The strangest detail Centralia offers is not the fire, it's the church. St. Ignatius Cemetery is still maintained. The graves are tended. Flowers are left. The tombstones stand perfectly straight. The fire has not yet reached beneath the cemetery. For now. The fire started because someone needed to burn some trash. That choice is still burning. That is not a metaphor. 8. Here is the town that science abandoned. Gilman, Colorado sits, or rather hangs, on the cliff face above the Eagle River Canyon. Not beside the canyon, on the canyon wall. The buildings of Gilman were constructed on the sheer rock face of Battle Mountain, where the New Jersey Zinc Company operated one of the most productive mines in the American West. Hundreds of workers and their families lived in company-owned housing, literally on the edge of a cliff. The buildings cantilevered out over a drop of several hundred feet. From the valley floor, Gilman looks like a photograph from a European mountain village that got wildly lost. White painted buildings in neat rows on an impossibly steep slope. Company offices, a school, a company store, a post office, all suspended on the side of a mountain above a mining operation that extracted zinc, lead, and silver for decades. The Environmental Protection Agency declared Gilman a Superfund site in 1984 due to contamination from mining operations that had poisoned the Eagle River downstream. The town was condemned. The 900 residents who had been living in the cliffside company town were told to leave. The company took down its equipment. The people took their belongings. The town stayed exactly where it was. Gilman today is entirely closed to the public. The buildings remain. Company records suggest the houses were furnished when the residents left, that there was not time or incentive to strip the interiors down. Researchers who have documented the site from a distance report seeing curtains still in windows, a basketball hoop still attached to a wall near what was the school, a playground structure rusted but upright near the residential blocks. The most striking image of Gilman is visible from Colorado State Highway 24 as you drive north along the Eagle River Valley. Look up and to the right at the right moment, and you'll see white building faces above the tree line, impossibly high on the cliff. They look inhabited from that distance. They haven't been inhabited since 1984. Everything is still up there. The town just decided to stop having people in it. 7. The locals never called it a ghost town. They called it the place that washed away. Corvetta was a small mill community in western Oregon, in the Coast Range foothills, that existed in the 1920s and 1930s to support a logging operation. The timber company built the infrastructure, the company housing, the rail line that brought timber to the mill, the water tower visible above the tree line. At its peak, roughly 400 people lived there. Mill workers, their wives, children, a company doctor, a school teacher. In January 1936, heavy rains and a failure of upstream logging slash piles sent a debris flow down the slope above Corvetta. A debris flow is not a flood in the conventional sense. It is a moving mass of mud, rock, broken timber, and water traveling at the speed and force of a freight train. What hit Corvetta lasted approximately 12 minutes, by one account. Company records show that 22 people were killed. The company records also show that by February of that same year, operations had been permanently suspended. The company did not rebuild. The rail line was removed. The surviving residents were relocated. No new community grew on the site. Today, the forest has completely reclaimed the Corvetta site. The location is known to local historians, but unmarked on public maps. Beneath the undergrowth, researchers with ground-penetrating equipment have found the concrete footings of the mill building. A portion of the old water tower base still stands in a clearing, waist-high, covered in moss. The moss has been growing on it for roughly 90 years. If you drove through the Coast Range foothills on a gray Oregon morning, you would pass within 2 miles of Corvetta and never know a 400-person community existed there. The trees are now old enough to have no memory of it at all. What matters here isn't the disaster, it's the silence that followed. No memorial, no marker. Just the forest growing back over the space where children went to school. 6. Call this one the town that embarrassed the government. Treese, Kansas, is Pitcher's lesser-known twin, and in some ways its mirror image. If Pitcher is famous, Treese is the town that shows the pattern isn't a coincidence. Sitting directly on the Kansas side of the Oklahoma border, Treese was part of the same tri-state mining district that poisoned Pitcher. The same lead and zinc mines, the same chat piles, the same contaminated water table, the same elevated blood lead levels in children. The chat piles around Treese are, in some ways, more dramatic than those at Pitcher. One pile near the town's edge stood over 20 stories tall. Children played on the chat piles for generations, sliding down the gray gravel faces on pieces of cardboard, because the chat piles were the only significant topographical feature in an otherwise flat landscape. They didn't know they were playing on toxic waste. No one told them clearly enough, or early enough. Federal and state cleanup efforts were underway through the 2000s, but the contamination was so embedded in the soil structure that cleanup projections ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, with no guarantee of success. The government conducted buyouts. By 2012, the last residents had left or been relocated. What distinguishes Treese from Pitcher is a single detail that local environmental advocates pressed hard on: the record of when the contamination was known versus when residents were informed. Internal memos suggest awareness of serious lead exposure risks existed within regulatory circles years before families in Treese received clear guidance about what was in their soil, their water, and their children's blood. The school in Treese closed in 2010. The last class graduated 23 students. One of those students reportedly came back to watch the school building be demolished and stood in the empty field afterward for a long time before getting in his car and driving away. The chat piles are still there, partially stabilized, partially still blowing dust on windy days across what used to be a neighborhood. Dust that you really should not breathe. 5. Here is the town that lost an argument with progress. South Fork, in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, is remembered today primarily in connection with the disaster that it caused, rather than one that affected it. South Fork was the home of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, an exclusive retreat for Pittsburgh industrialists that maintained a private lake above Johnstown by means of an earthen dam. On May 31, 1889, that dam failed. The resulting flood destroyed Johnstown and killed over 2,200 people downstream. South Fork itself survived the immediate disaster, but was essentially destroyed by the decades that followed it. The legal aftermath of the Johnstown flood involved a question that became famous in American legal history. Could the members of the South Fork Club be held liable? The courts ultimately ruled that they could not, applying a doctrine of natural catastrophe that has been contested by legal scholars ever since. No club member paid damages, but South Fork, as a community, paid a different kind of price. Its association with the flood, the legal proceedings, and the industrial interests involved left the town in a peculiar kind of limbo. As the steel industry that had brought wealth to western Pennsylvania slowly declined through the 20th century, South Fork declined with it. Walk through South Fork today, and the physical evidence of a once functioning community is still present. Brick storefronts on the main street, a few residential blocks, a rail line still visible through the valley. But the population, which peaked above 2,000 in the early 20th century, has declined to a few hundred. Businesses have not returned to the storefronts. The storefronts stand with plywood in the windows. The South Fork Dam site itself is preserved. The earth that formed the embankment is still there, partially eroded, recognizable as a dam if you know what you're looking at. A historical marker at the site lists the facts neutrally. 2,209 people dead. The dam that caused it still visible as a gentle ridge of earth above the valley. What that dam cost, downstream, was the equivalent of a mid-sized American city. South Fork is still paying for it now, in a different currency. 4. They named it the city that the desert ate. Rhyolite, Nevada, was born in 1904 and dead by 1920. 16 years. In that span, it grew from a prospector's camp to a town with a 3-story bank building, a train station with a covered passenger concourse, an opera house, electricity, running water, and a population estimated between 6,000 and 10,000 at its peak. In the Nevada desert, in 16 years, from nothing. The Bullfrog Gold Rush brought the population in. The exhaustion of the Bullfrog mine took them back out. When it became clear by 1908 that the ore was playing out, the departure was not gradual. It was a migration. People loaded what they could carry onto wagons and trains. What they couldn't carry, they left. Buildings were stripped of their lumber, which was hauled to other communities. Furniture was taken or abandoned. What makes Rhyolite different from most ghost towns is the scale of what remains. The Cook Bank Building, 3 stories of reinforced concrete with arched windows on the facade, still stands in the desert. Concrete doesn't rot. The walls are intact, the windows empty, the interior open to the sky through a collapsed roof. But the structure itself is as solid as the day it was built. You can stand at the base of it and look straight up through 3 floors of open air to the sky. The train station, the train platform, the concrete shell of the Montgomery-Shoshone mine office, all still standing because they were built of concrete rather than wood. And the desert does not eat concrete at the same rate it eats everything else. The most famous image of Rhyolite is the Tom Kelly Bottle House, built in 1906 from over 50,000 glass bottles, mortared together into walls. The bottles were not decorative. They were a practical building material in a desert community where glass was available and lumber was expensive. Sunlight through those walls creates a mosaic of amber and green light on the interior floor, a light show that no one designed and no one has photographed adequately. There is no electricity in Rhyolite, no running water. No one lives there. The bottle house stands because no one has found a good reason to knock it down yet. In the Nevada desert at night, the Cook Bank Building is the only 3-story structure for 50 miles in any direction. 3. This is the village that knew something was wrong. Centrahoma, Oklahoma, is not famous. That is part of its story. This was a small Cole County community that reached its modest peak in the early 20th century and spent the following decades in slow decline. By the 1970s, the population had thinned dramatically. Old buildings sat empty on the main road. The school had consolidated with a neighboring district. But what happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s is the part that still does not have a satisfying explanation. In a period of roughly 4 years, multiple families who had lived in Centrahoma for generations made the decision to leave within a very short period of each other, not following a single event, not in response to an announced disaster, but quietly, individually, in a sequence that people who study the town describe as a cascade without a visible trigger. Local records show property transactions from that period occurring at below market prices, not dramatically below, but consistently below the surrounding county average. People were selling quickly without negotiating hard. That is what you do when you want to leave more than you want money. But here is the detail that no explanation has cleanly accounted for. In the small Baptist church on the edge of town, a white painted wooden structure with a small bell tower, The Sunday service attendance records, kept by the congregation in a bound ledger, show regular entries through 1979. And then, without any recorded event, without a final service, without a note in the ledger, the entries stop on a date in November of 1979. The next entry is dated 14 months later. It reads simply, "Building closed." The ledger is preserved at a county historical society. Researchers have looked at it. No one has explained the gap. There are three main theories offered by people who study such things. First, economic collapse was severe enough in Cole County at that time that the emigration was purely financial, and the ledger gap is a record-keeping artifact. Second, a localized environmental event. Underground gas, contaminated water, made the area uninhabitable in a way that was never formally documented, because no one with authority came to document it. Third, and this is the one that local historians note with some discomfort, some people in the surrounding county believe the community experienced something that no institutional category has been built for. None of those theories has been proven. The second one is the most consistent with documented patterns of rural evacuation in the United States. But no contamination study has been conducted on the Centrahoma site. The church is still standing. The bell tower still has its bell. The ledger is still in the archive at the County Historical Society, if you know where to ask. 2. Here is the resort that became a secret. Prentiss, Mississippi is not a ghost town by the classic definition. It still exists in a reduced form. But the version of Prentiss that existed in the 1930s and 1940s, as a gathering point for an African-American community during the era of segregation, a place with its own hotels, its own entertainment venues, its own economy, and its own cultural identity. That version vanished in a way that most American history books have not found space to record. During the years of segregation, Black Americans across the South developed parallel economies and parallel geographies because they had no choice. They built their own resort towns, their own beaches, their own entertainment districts. These places were vibrant, sophisticated, and largely invisible to white America at the time. Not because they were hidden, but because white America was not looking. Prentiss hosted summer tourism from African American families across the South during a period when the Gulf Coast beaches were legally segregated. Families drove from Hattiesburg, from Jackson, from New Orleans, to reach a place where they could simply exist without the architecture of segregation pressing on every moment. When legal segregation ended in the mid-1960s, the parallel economy that had sustained these spaces faced a paradox. Integration opened other options. The communities that had been built out of necessity lost their economic organizing principle. The hotels that had served Black travelers no longer had a captive clientele. The restaurants and clubs and summer cottages that had defined those spaces found themselves competing in a newly open market, often without the capital to compete. In Prentiss, the process was gradual through the 1970s and completed through the 1980s. The hotel buildings were sold, repurposed, or demolished. The particular cultural identity of the place, its history as a site of Black leisure and dignity under impossible conditions, was not preserved, not memorialized, not marked with signs. If you drive through Prentiss today, there are buildings and businesses and a functional small town. There is no physical record of what this place was between 1930 and 1965. The record exists in people. Elderly residents of surrounding counties remember it. Their grandchildren are beginning to record those memories before they are gone entirely. One oral history project at a university in Mississippi has collected testimony from over 40 individuals who visited or worked in Prentiss during that period. Those recordings are in an archive. The archive does not have adequate funding to digitize all of them. That is a different kind of vanishing, and in some ways the most complete kind. Not the absence of buildings, the absence of memory. Before we reach first place, pause for a moment. The 13 entries above involve fire, poison, economics, law, and slow entropy. What comes next is something else, something older, something that no category in the list above quite covers. Because the last town on this list didn't decline, it didn't flood, it didn't lose an argument with a corporation, or a highway, or a reservoir project. It just stopped existing. One day there were people there, then there weren't. And the only explanation anyone has ever been able to offer, in over 400 years of trying, is a word carved into a wooden post. 1. This is the colony with no goodbye. Roanoke Island, North Carolina, is the site of the first English settlement attempt in what would become the United States. In 1587, 115 colonists, men, women, and children, arrived on Roanoke Island in the Outer Banks, under the sponsorship of Sir Walter Raleigh. The settlement had been attempted once before, in 1585, with limited success. This second attempt was more ambitious. Families came this time, not just soldiers and explorers. Virginia Dare, born August 18, 1587, was the first English child born in the Americas. Their governor, John White, returned to England in late 1587 to secure additional supplies. The war with Spain, the Armada crisis, delayed any return voyage for 3 years. White finally returned to Roanoke in August 1590. The settlement was empty. Every structure remained. The houses were still standing. The palisade fence that the colonists had built for protection was still intact. There were signs that the departure had been organized rather than panicked. Goods had been carefully packed, certain heavy items buried rather than abandoned in haste. There was no evidence of violence, no graves, no signs of battle. There were 2 clues. Carved into a palisade post was the word, quote, 4. Carved into a nearby tree was the letters, quote, 5. Before leaving, White and the colonists had agreed on a signal. If they moved, they would carve the name of their destination. If they left under distress, they would add a cross above the letters. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of an island approximately 50 miles south, modern Hatteras Island, and also the name of a Native American people who lived there and had been generally friendly to the English colonists. John White, due to storms, was unable to reach Croatoan Island before being forced to turn back. He never returned. No English search party reached Croatoan Island to look for the colonists in any timely fashion. What happened to the 115 people of Roanoke has been debated for 435 years. The theories number in the dozens. The most widely supported among researchers who have studied the physical and documentary evidence goes like this. The colonists, facing dwindling supplies and an uncertain wait for White's return, made a decision to relocate. Croatoan Island, where they had Native American contacts, was the logical destination. They moved there, or to the mainland near the friendly Croatoan people, and assimilated, partly or fully, into Native American communities over the following generations. Archaeological work on Hatteras Island, where Croatoan Island once was, has turned up English artifacts, a signet ring, copper pieces of European origin, a fragment of finely worked iron, in Native American site layers. These finds are not definitive proof. They are consistent with the relocation theory. A second prominent theory suggests the colonists moved inland toward the Chesapeake Bay, where they may have lived for decades before being killed in a conflict involving the powerful Powhatan Confederacy around the time English settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607. The Powhatan leader, Wahun Seneca, reportedly told Jamestown colonists about people living to the south who used English tools. He later reportedly said they had been killed. This account, if accurate, would suggest the Roanoke colonists survived for 20 years before their story ended. A third group of researchers has focused on the possibility that disease, violence, or starvation ended the colony in the years immediately after White's departure, and that the carved word quote, _6__ was not a destination, but a farewell, a message pointing toward people who might know what happened, rather than people the colonists were going to join. What we know for absolute certainty is this: 115 people arrived on Roanoke Island in 1587. 3 years later, the island was empty. The fence was standing. The post read __7_7_ John White, who had left his daughter and granddaughter among those colonists, spent the rest of his life trying to return and failing. Imagine standing on Roanoke Island the moment White stepped ashore in August 1590. The gate of the palisade hanging open, the sound of the Atlantic behind you, calling out names and hearing nothing back, walking from house to house, and each one empty. No fire, no bones, no sign of catastrophe, just absence. The houses were still there, the fence was still there, the community was not. The carved word __8__ has weathered 435 years. The answer it was meant to point to is still, in its complete form, unknown. Not a ruin, not a grave, just a door that no one came back through. 13 towns, 13 different endings. Fire underground, poison in the soil, floodwaters that never came, a highway that moved and took everything with it, a mine that paid for everything until it didn't, a cultural geography erased without a marker, and one word carved into wood that has outlasted every explanation ever offered for it. What all 13 share is something simpler than any single cause. Communities exist because people choose, every day, to maintain them, to stay, to invest, to remain. When those choices stop, for any reason or no reason, the physical infrastructure of a town survives for a while. Buildings stand, streets hold their shape, signs hang. But the thing a town actually is, the agreements between people, the shared calendar, the knowledge of which door to knock on in an emergency, that thing has no concrete form. And when it's gone, there is no artifact that captures it. Not the Cook Bank building standing 3 stories high in the Nevada desert. Not the roses blooming in Cahaba along streets that no longer have names. Not the bell still hanging in a tower above a church whose last Sunday service no one recorded. Here is the question this list leaves you with. Between Centralia, where something physical and permanent is actively destroying a community from below, and Roanoke, where nothing explained the disappearance at all, which is the harder thing to accept. If you found this worth your time, leave a mark. The same way those colonists left Croatoan, just to indicate you were here. Stay safe, and see you soon.